So let's do the Iran war update.
That's a big one, hey?
This is now, let's call it 2 weeks in. It's about day 16, but let's say it's day 14 of the Iran war. Remember the one that was only going to take a week? Well, that's taken twice as long already. So what's happened?
What was it? 2 weeks to flatten the curve, Bruce.
2 weeks to flatten Iran.
And Palestine, bit of a theme there, isn't there?
So what are we doing here? So what's happened in the last week? So the Americans / Israelis, and like I said last week, I'm just going to say the Americans, it's easier. The Americans, or maybe I should just say the Israelis, and everyone can assume that includes the Americans, because obviously it does.
It does, yeah. But when you say one, it's okay. When you say the other, it's anti-Semitic, Bruce. So, but anyway.
Okay, so the Emiralis have been pounding Iran just the same as they did in the first week. They've done it in the second week, and you're getting almost daily scorecards, a bit like during the Vietnam War where they did the body counts. Well, for Iran, we're getting these daily, very impressive scorecards delivered by Hegseth and others. And they'll tell you things like, in the last week we struck 15,000 targets, we've destroyed blah, blah, blah. And the US believes they've destroyed all of Iran's Navy and Air Force. And they think that's the fact that they're telling you all this tells you that these are their war goals. Their war goals are to rack up large amounts of equipment destroyed and people killed. And that's because that's what they're concentrating on. That's what they're reporting on. And that looks impressive superficially. And in fact, so impressive is that Trump has pretty much already said that the war is won. And in fact, on day 10, and I think we're day 15 or 16 now, Trump said that the war was very complete, that the US military had annihilated the Navy and Air Force of Iran, and that things were moving on ahead of schedule. And he said the only thing they've still got to do is take over the Strait of Hormuz. And I think his optimism is based on the sorts of reports that he's getting and retweeting. So he said that things are going well, it's pretty much over, and that Iran has no has no Navy, no communications, and no Air Force left. So that seems to be what he's basing his assessment of the war on. Now, if that's true, he's not obviously a military historian like I am, or he would have seen where this sort of claim goes wrong in the past. And a great example was the Vietnam War, because you had the same sort of situation in the Vietnam War. The Americans had air superiority, if not supremacy. They dropped massive amounts of bombs over many years, and in the end they lost. And the reason they lost was encapsulated in this conversation that was reported at the peace talks afterwards. So what it says, there was a famous conversation between one of the US negotiators, Colonel Harry Summers, and one of the Vietnamese generals, what was his name? Col Chu. And it said, in Hanoi in April 1975, just after President Gerald Ford conceded defeat, Colonel Summers, then the chief of the US delegation's negotiating team, was chatting with his North Vietnamese counterpart, Colonel Tu. And he said, you never defeated us on the battlefield, not once. And the Vietnamese colonel sort of screwed up his face and said, true, but irrelevant. So the reason that the US lost the Vietnam War, despite the fact that they won every combat in it, they had air superiority, they dropped vast amounts of bombs, they blew the country back into the Stone Age, but they still lost because the war did not turn on how much stuff got blown up. The war turned on, as we've said, in asymmetric war, the weaker side wins by not losing and the stronger side loses by not winning. So after 10 years, the Americans ruined their economy, spent vast amounts of money, suffered 50,000 dead. And at the end of it, the people at home got tired of it. They got sick of paying for it. They got sick of seeing it on the television. And in the end, the government fell and the troops came home. So the Americans thought they were winning or fighting a bomb them all to hell war, but they weren't. The Vietnamese were fighting a be still standing in some form at the end war, and they were, and that's why they won.
For survival. It was like their way of survival.
All they had to do was to still be standing at the end, and they were. And this declaring victory early on the basis of an shock and awe campaign is a repeated mistake of Western militaries, US in particular. And you might remember this famous picture where then US President George Bush, he claimed victory 8 weeks into the Iraq War. So this is 8 weeks into 2003's war for Iraq. He stood on the deck of a US aircraft carrier with that banner behind him that said mission accomplished, and said, 8 weeks in, we've won. Well, had they? He was basing it on the shock and awe air campaign, but they hadn't won, because 2 years later, I was in Iraq working in a US military hospital just north of Baghdad, where we were treating battle casualties at the rate of 100 a day. And in fact, that war did not officially end until 8 years in, when the US admitted defeat and withdrew. And that was after they lost 4,500 troops and dropped who knows what tonnage of bombs. So 8 weeks in, based on the initial shock and awe, the US president said, we've won. 8 years later, they left in defeat. So that's an example of how you don't want to declare victory based on, one, the wrong victory conditions. You know, we bombed you all to hell. Yeah, so what? And also based on what it looked like early on. So they lost that. And it is very common in wars to get this, what I call the home by Christmas effect. So at the start of wars, people are very optimistic that they're going to be easy and short. And that was true in the First World War, if you remember. You know, it started in August 1914, and they thought they'd be home by Christmas. Didn't end till November 1918. So once again, early on, they thought it'd be easy and quick and, you know, a bit of a jolly adventure, but it grew into something far bigger. And that's what wars do. And this is likely to be happening in the current Iran war because it is escalating. You know, early on, the US killed the Iranian supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, and started dismantling many of the major cities. But something new happened this week when Trump shifted his focus and bombed, as he said, the hell out of Karg Island. Now, Karg Island is a large oil terminal way up the north end of the Gulf. And it's really important because the Persian Gulf is very shallow. So there are very few places you can actually put a terminal to bring a super tanker in to load it with oil. And so almost all of the Iranian oil exports go via Karg Island, you know, almost up to Iraq, end of the Persian Gulf. And 90% of the Iranian oil exports go out of there. And believe it or not, the Iranians are still sailing tankers through the Persian Gulf and out through the Strait of Hormuz and exporting their stuff. That seems a bit odd to me. It's a wonder the Americans aren't boarding or sinking their ships, but so far they haven't. Anyway, the US has just struck, and in other words, crippled Iran's major oil export terminal. And in my opinion, this was a very bad idea because this, you know, if Iran can't export their oil, what's to stop them preventing everybody else from exporting their oil? You know, if we've destroyed Karg Island, why shouldn't they just go, well, we'll destroy Bahrain, we'll destroy UAE, we'll destroy Al Fujara, Kuwait, right? What's to stop them simply destroying all of the oil infrastructure in the Gulf? They got nothing to lose if they've already had theirs lost. So I think the suggestion that Karg Island would be targeted for destruction is an extremely poor move. It should have been kept as a threat, because once you've played that card, it's played.
Mm-hmm.
Much better to have the Old Bomb Cargo Island card in your hand as a threat than it is to actually play that card. And the Americans have just played that card. So as I said, what's to stop Iran from turning around and saying, okay, if that's how you want to play it, we're going to blow up all of your oil infrastructure. And indeed, that's what they've done this week. So they've targeted Al Fujairah. And Al Fujairah is important because it's one of the two ways you can get oil out of the Persian Gulf that don't go through the Strait of Hormuz. So Al Fujairah crosses the peninsula, as you can see there. It's a pipeline that bypasses the Strait of Hormuz, goes from the UAE on one side, virtually Dubai, across to Al Fujairah on the other. And fun fact, I've actually flown into airports in both places, both Al Fujairah and Dubai in the UAE. So Al Fujairah is really important. It's one of the two ways you can bypass a blockaded Strait of Hormuz. So the Iranians have reacted to the "we'll blow up your oil terminal" by saying, well, we'll see you and we'll blow up yours. So let's play a little clippy there. What have we got? That'll be you, I think.
Yeah, I've taken mine off. I've given you the full suite.
So in the last couple of days, this is Al Fujairah.
Wow. UAE, eh? Wow.
Now, do you notice there the caption says that it was caused by debris from a drone that was shot?
You're right. Debris. Do they make these things so insecure that a bit of debris could come down? And yeah, I'm pretty sure everybody's buying that, eh?
We see that all the time because by saying that, you don't have to admit that your missile defense failed. Didn't fail. We hit the thing. It's just, a few burning bits fell and that caused the fire. So you'll notice that's a common story. The West will admit, it got struck by a bit of debris.
Of course.
No, the Iranians smacked that with a drone or two and caused a massive fire.
Yeah, wow.
As I said, it's important because it's one of the two ways you can bypass the Strait of Hormuz. And here's the other one. So this is the 1,200 kilometre Trans-Saudi pipeline that goes from basically Qatar, or as I think my American friends call it, Qatar, across to. They do. It was really annoying in briefings. I was talking about Qatar. So you can ship oil across Saudi Arabia, across that 1,200 kilometre pipeline to a terminal just north of Jeddah in Saudi Arabia. So they're the two ways you can potentially export oil from the Persian Gulf if the strait is blocked. Well, as you see, the Iranians have just struck one of those pipelines, Al Fujairah, and they're certainly capable of striking this Trans-Saudi pipeline if it comes to that. And both of these pipelines are workarounds. They do not have the capacity to replace the multiple large super tankers that were previously being filled. They're better than nothing, but they're not full replacements. And look, even if they were, you'll notice that the Trans-Saudi pipeline requires access to the Red Sea. So even if you can load your tanker in the Red Sea there, you've got to get out of the Red Sea, and there's two ways to do it. One is to go up through the Suez Canal, and I don't know whether the largest super tankers can get through that. Maybe they can, maybe they can't. Or you sail them out south through that little choke point that's circled at the bottom, and that's called the Bab el-Mandab. And you might remember that the Houthis, who are an Iranian allied group in Yemen, have been using anti-ship missiles to attack shipping in the Red Sea. And in fact, for a period of many months in the last couple of years, have closed shipping through the Red Sea, effectively closing the Suez Canal as well. So these two workarounds to a Strait of Hormuz closure are both potentially interdicted. You can stop both of them if you choose to.
Yeah. Yep. Yep. A lot of moving pieces, isn't there? Lots of moving pieces.
But Trump said it's just about over. Remember that?
Yeah, no, good on you. I think it's much bigger. The problem is it's much bigger than Trump, and I'll make a comment later on when you're finished with this section.
Anyway, the current picture is this. The strait remains closed, irrespective of what damage has been done to Iran proper by Amirali airstrikes.
Mm-hmm.
And this is important because, as I've said before, the US and the Iranians are not fighting the same war. So the Americans think they can bomb Iran into submission, and the Iranians think that they can blockade the strait and force the Americans into submission. So Iran's identified the key thing that they have to do is to close the Strait of Hormuz, and they've done it. Now, identifying this key point is a maxim of military planning that goes back centuries. So identifying the key target that you have to destroy to beat your enemy is called the Schwerpunkt. And the Schwerpunkt, or center of gravity, was a term used by Prussian General Clausewitz in his book in 1832. So he wrote Vom Krieg, which is On War, in 1832. This is one of the classic military strategy works of all time, up there with Sun Tzu's Art of War. And in fact, I've read both. And so Clausewitz said that you have to identify your Schwerpunkt and attack it. So the Iranians understand that the Americans' Schwerpunkt is closure of the strait, and the Americans think the Iranians' Schwerpunkt is bombing them back to the Stone Age. But the Iranians are right and the Americans are wrong, and that's why no amount of bombing is going to win the war for America, because it doesn't do the thing that the Iranians are trying to do, which is, well, the opposite. It doesn't open the strait that the Iranians have closed. And in fact, I said before, I don't think Trump's read much military history, and I have. I've read about 50 years worth of it. And so I already know that bombing almost never causes your enemy to surrender. Simply bombing them almost never works. And there are many historical examples in the last century. So during the Blitz, London was bombed for 57 days straight, days and nights straight, by the Nazis. 40,000 citizens were killed, 1 million bombs were dropped, but this didn't knock Britain out of the war. And on the other side of the fence, Berlin, the capital of then Nazi Germany, was bombed 363 times over the 5 or so years that followed the Blitz. So 363 bombing raids, sometimes 1,000 bombers in a raid, sometimes less. And in the end, 80% of the city was destroyed. But you know what? Germany didn't surrender just because of bombing. Eventually they surrendered once ground troops occupied Berlin. So there's a couple of examples why the current American strategy, bombing the heck out of your enemies, is unlikely to cause them to surrender. And let's face it, that really has been one of the major stated goals of the war, regime change.
Same old play card, isn't it? It's happened all through time. Current time, anyway.
And perhaps the only example where you could argue, and people argue against this, but where you could argue that bombing did force the surrender of your enemy was the atomic bombings of Japan. Now, if that's true, and like I say, not all scholars believe that was the final straw, because Japan was starving, they were blockaded. The Soviets had just started invading as well, having freed up troops from the end of the war in Europe. But let's say that the atomic bomb really did force the surrender of the Japanese in 1945. do we really want to go there? Is that our benchmark here? We'll nuke you to make you give up?
And
I might add that even when Japan did surrender after 2 nuclear strikes, they didn't get regime change. The emperor remained. That was one of the key conditions for surrender. So, yeah, the chance that conventional bombing will achieve regime change in Iran is minuscule, and the likelihood that atomic bombing would do it is also small. And I really hope nobody wants to test that out.
Well, yeah, I think most people are probably crossing their fingers and praying that that doesn't happen, mate.
And, perhaps the best comparator to today, the question is, will bombing force your opponent to surrender? Perhaps the best comparison is the Vietnam War. And the reason for that is because it was an asymmetric conflict. The war between England and Britain, England and Germany, and between America and Japan, they were conventional conflicts. They weren't asymmetric guerrilla conflicts. But Vietnam was an asymmetric guerrilla conflict, as is the America-Iran war. And they tried even harder in Vietnam than they did in the Second World War. They dropped 2.5 times as many bombs on Vietnam during the Vietnam War as were dropped in every theatre of war in the Second World War.
Wow, that's crazy statistic. Wow.
Now, in addition to that, they put 500,000 troops in on the ground, and they had air superiority, if not air supremacy. Vietnam did have a small air force, and they still lost. So Vietnam is smaller and less technological than Iran. It's easier to invade because you've got friendly countries around it, friendly bases. And Vietnam had far less combat power than Iran has. And even bombing it all to heck and putting 500,000 troops in there still was not enough. So this is why I say that the American strategy of bombing Iran is unlikely to achieve their war aims.
Yeah.
Now, nuking Japan aside, history shows us that you never get an opposing country to surrender, and you never get regime change just by bombing. You have to put troops on the ground. And as Vietnam showed, sometimes putting troops on the ground is still not enough. But you never get surrender of your opponent until you occupy them. And the US is actually starting to talk about that with news that they're detaching a Marine deployment of about a bit over 2,000 men to the Middle East. So they're starting to talk about boots on the ground. Now, boots on the ground in the Persian Gulf would be an utter catastrophe. In fact, it's a total non-starter, in my opinion, because Iran is a very large country. It's very good defensive terrain, very mountainous. The Iranians have excellent industry for producing asymmetric weapons. Iran was a major source of IEDs in both the Iraq and the Afghan wars. They've got a religiously motivated population with a tradition of martyrdom. So the idea that the Americans could invade Iran is a pipe dream. It would be impossible to conquer. They failed in Iraq, which was a quarter the size and had a third of the population. And even worse, if you want to invade Iran, where are you going to stage your forces from? Where's the friendly base that you can supply them from? You can't get into the Persian Gulf. It's closed. Iraq, they already failed. And if they try and occupy Iraq again in order to attack Iran, they'll get another insurgency. So none of that's going to work. And as a historical comparator, back in the Iraq invasion, like I say, a third the number of population and a quarter the size of country, it took 5 months to build up the ground forces before they invaded Iraq. 5 months. And the invasion was a success, but then the occupation wasn't, and they lost after 8 years. And they had many, many troops on the ground, 500,000 troops on the ground, and 5 months to get ready for it. So to reiterate, when the Iraq invasion happened from Kuwait there, they had bases right next door, and they had an open Persian Gulf. So they could sail their logistics ships and their troop ships right up to Kuwait, let the guys off, get them organised, and then just hop over the border into Iraq. None of those things are possible here. So anything you hear about boots on the ground is a pipe dream. It can only end in the loss of all of the troops involved very quickly. And I seriously hope they never try it, because it's not possible.
Yeah, it's a definitely different war theatre, isn't it, this time? Yeah, it's almost bloody hell.
It is totally different to Iraq, much harder, and they lost in Iraq. We lost. I was there. I saw it.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, so much like, what was the beach there? Was it Normandy? Normandy, where we lost so many Allied troops trying to land on Normandy under massive hillside machine gun fire. Was it Normandy?
Yep. Well, that was an opposed landing, as was Gallipoli, by the way. And in both cases, they lodged troops ashore against resistance, and it was very difficult. But Gallipoli failed. They were contained. And Normandy succeeded, but their bases were like 50 miles away. They only had to cross the channel from England to get into Normandy. Where are we going to supply these troops from? How are we going to get them into Iran? They're like 1,000 kilometers from any friendly base. And Iran's already showed they can target those bases. Iran has been putting missiles into Israel. It's been putting missiles into Saudi Arabia. You don't have that safe staging area where you can put your guys ashore, build up the supplies and organise them, and then gig on. No, utterly impossible. So anything you hear about boots on the ground, you can immediately discount it. It's a pipe dream.
Yeah. Bruce, I'm just going to quickly ask the audience something, because obviously maybe they're very, very intent on listening to what you're saying, but very few comments coming in today. So I'm not sure whether all the platforms are being a little bit suppressed, but just if someone can just chuck a comment in, haven't seen one come in for a little while, and it might be just that they're listening intently.
Well, Gail said that.
Yeah, but I think that was just for Gail, because I think Trish said it's okay on her end. So maybe nothing. Just wanted to ask the question if someone could chuck a couple of comments in the chat to see whether everything's playing nicely. So I'm seeing it's streaming. I can see it's streaming. So on the platforms. Yeah. So whether or not people are being, whether. Yeah.
Well, I hope it's okay.
If not, people are going to replay it. It's replayed anyway. That's all right. It's saved wherever. So, yep. I think listen, I think it's more of this, Bruce, listening intently. I think this is a topic that people want to. It's a topic people really want to hear about, and you're bringing in a great lot of insight into it, mate. So good on you.
And look, I hope people are interested, because I regard this as a turning point in world history. I think this will see the fall of the American empire. I think it'll see a complete change in energy availability in Australia and places who need energy exports. I think this may well be the death knell for Israel, which after all is highly dependent on economic and military aid from the US. I think when this ends, I think the US is no longer a military power in the Middle East. I think they're gone.
Well, be cool.
That's what I see happening. Let's see if I'm right.
You've been pretty right on a lot of things we've covered, Bruce. I mean, and then when you've been wrong, you've corrected yourself as well, which has been far and few between.
Nobody could have predicted this, Mark.
Yeah, common theme, that, isn't it?
All right, where were we? Okay, in a bit of a watching the show moment, I'm sort of pleased to see that the mainstream media has discovered the term asymmetric warfare and has started talking about it, because I've been using that term since the start. And yeah, it is. And not only are they realising that the weapons being used are different, but it appears that they're realising that the victory conditions are different too. So this story here is talking about the use of an asymmetric weapon, naval mines, and an asymmetric target, closure of the Strait of Hormuz, rather than air defence interceptors over Tehran. Good to see.
Yes, paying attention, watching the show. Good on you guys.
Righto. So what's it all costing? Well, initial reports say about $2 billion a day. So that's $2,000 million a day. And that's just in weapons expenditures. That's the cost of the missiles and munitions that they're expending, blowing up. Add to that the cost of the damage that they're causing, both in Iran and also the reciprocal damage in the Gulf states. And some commenters are saying that there were 27 US military bases in the region, all of which have been struck, and that all of their major early warning radars have been destroyed, all of them. And those large radars are $500 million to $1 billion each. So it's not just the cost of the stuff they're sending out, it's the cost of what's coming back as well. And it's massive. $2 billion a day is the rough estimate. And of course, that will all have to be rebuilt by the military industrial complex. You know, those radars that were lost, we're busy building more of them. The thousands of missiles that have been expended, they'll be busy building more of them. Yeah. And this is all non-productive expenditure. What have you got left after a missile hits a radar? What did you get for your $1 billion? Nothing. It's gone. You've vaporized a huge amount of wealth. And it's got a world, even if the strait reopens soon, and I don't think it will, but even if it reopens soon, the cost of this is baked into the American economy, which means the worldwide economy.
That's right. Affects all of us. That's right. Affects all of us.
It does. You know, I'm already paying 70 cents a litre more for diesel. It affects me.
Yep, and then obviously the transport companies, Bruce, will always be getting the hit. Where does that cost go? It goes onto the supermarkets, and what do the supermarkets do? They've got to pass the cost on that, otherwise they go broke. I mean, the big ones that have squeezed out the little small ones over the decades, obviously they're probably a bit better sheltered, but still the prices. So you'll see it at the grocery store, you'll see it at the bloody petrol pump, you'll see it in all aspects of our lives.
Yep, it's inevitable. That money's been blown, and it'll be replaced with more printed money.
Yeah, amen. That's right.
And worse still,
like it's designed, Bruce. It's almost like it's designed, isn't it?
No one could have predicted this. Worse still, this week, Albo stood up and said that he wants Australia to be involved. So he's already announced that he's sending one of our airborne radar control aircraft, one of the E7s, the Wedgetails, is going to go to the Gulf. So they're sending one there. And obviously there'll be a major logistic effort to maintain that. I mean, I don't know what the number is, but it must be 100 to 200 people they've got to send to keep one aircraft in the air part-time. So that's going to be a pretty significant effort. But it doesn't matter. The real problem here is Australia stuck up its hand and said, we want to be on the losing side. Because let's face it, the Amiralis are going to be the losing side here. So we're sticking up our hand and saying to Iran, we want to be on the losing side.
Funny about that.
And Trump's already messaged out that he wants all the allies, he wants them in there with their weaponry. So he wants the French, the Germans, the British, the Australians, the Koreans. He wants them all to send warships to the Gulf so they can keep the strait open. So what's happening next? We've sent one aircraft. How long before we send a ship? And how long before we lose a ship if we send a ship? And for what?
Yep.
All we're doing is saying to Iran, we want to be on the losing side here.
Yep.
Now, amazingly, Albo said that the Australian deployment is defensive in nature and that it's going to be used to defend against unprovoked attacks by the Iranians.
I thought defense was Unprovoked attacks. All right. It isn't defense like we're talking about our country here. We're talking about our nation. And don't you defend a nation by not going into, oh, anyway.
Yeah, I'm glad you're laughing there because it is ludicrous. We all know who started this war, and we all know that Iran's response to it is entirely justified.
Yeah, no country will ever. Depends on, regardless of the regime and how badly they might have been treating their people, the women, whatever. No country is ever going to stand by and have another country come in and start obliterating it and not do anything about it. I mean, how ridiculous is that even to make comments like that?
Yeah, as the police know, you know, if you walk into the middle of a domestic violence incident, both of the people in the room are going to try and stab you. That's how it works.
That's how it works.
That's how it works. All right. And is Australia sending this token force, one aircraft, who knows, one ship, whatever, is sending that to the Gulf really in Australia's best interests? Now, Iran has already said that the Gulf, the Strait of Hormuz, is only closed to American and Israeli ships and their allies. Well, that includes us. So we've stuck our hand up and said we want to be allies of America. And if we send an aircraft or warships, and we've certainly said we'll send an aircraft, that's merely going to signal to Iran, okay, the Gulf is closed to stuff that Australia wants to get out of it. And if you argue that the purpose of expeditionary warfare, the purpose of sending forces a long way out of your country, is to defend it, in this case by keeping the resource flow open, well, it's completely the opposite. Sending Australian military forces to the Gulf is going to close those resources to us. It's not going to open it. So it's exactly the opposite of what you might think you're going to achieve. It's batshit crazy, and it's causing us great damage for no benefit.
Yeah.
You depressed enough yet?
Well, I mean, this has been happening all through the eons, Bruce. It's you know, I guess how do you think some of those nations felt when they were being invaded by some of those early? Well, you know, it's been happening all through the decades, hasn't it?
Why were we in Gallipoli?
Millennia. Yep.
Why? Why were the Australian 9th Division in Libya? Why?
Yep.
Why was I in Iraq? Why was I in Afghanistan? Why? And this is far worse because those recent wars, Iraq and Afghan, they were relatively modest. We had a relatively small number of casualties and not much equipment lost. This is serious. If Australia gets involved here, we risk losing a lot of hardware and significant numbers of people.
Yep.
We can avoid that by not going, and we could keep the strait open to us by not going.
Well, it's all down to Albo, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, remember back to Howard, you know, he was deputy sheriff to Bush. All right, so that's all a bit depressing. And in summary, what have we had in the last week? We've had more escalation in the Iran war. We've got Australia directly involved. The strait remains closed, and my petrol bills are massively increased. So last week's assessment remains true this week. Do not underestimate how serious this could get and how much this could change Australia and the rest of the world in the next who knows how long.
Yeah.
And if you and I are wincing at paying $2.70 for diesel or $2.30 for petrol, it could get a lot worse. Because this screenshot was sent to me by a friend of mine in Launceston in Tasmania. This was what was being charged this week at a service station in Tassie.
Wow, Gail.
$5 a litre.
Won't be going there, Gail. I hope that's not near you. Jeez.
That was in Lonnie, apparently. And I don't know if it's typical, but that was in Lonnie. So that's sort of my What's he said there? Hang on, that's not the one I want. It's that one. I know people want to sympathise with Islam, but it's a death sentence. I'm not talking about Islam here. I don't disagree with you, and we've spoken that many times. What I'm saying here is that we've bought into a conflict that is not going to turn out well for us, irrespective of who the opponent is. And I'm not talking about morality or any of that. This is not the Crusades again. We are watching a developing conflict that's going to hurt the Western world badly. And it wouldn't matter if it was Muslims that were doing it or if it was Seventh-day Adventists. The effect would be the same.